I'm Benedict Allen, and I've spent 25 years heading off alone into deserts and jungles and tundra. Now I'm going to follow in the footsteps of those who I think are the defining travel writers of the 20th century, the golden era of the travel writer, and look through the brief and unique window they gave us onto the world and into themselves. In the summer of 1935, a young man from a small village in Gloucestershire arrived in northern Spain and started walking. Laurie Lee was only 20. He had no money and no particular idea of where he was going or what he hoped to achieve. But he kept on walking. By the time he finished his trip, he'd covered 1,200 miles and walked all the way down to the south coast of Spain. 35 years later, Laurie Lee wrote his account of that epic journey, As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. It was to become a book I valued above almost all others. This is something I've treasured ever since a little boy. I don't know how it ends up in my bedroom shelves, but I suppose my mum and dad just didn't know where else to put it. It's a copy of As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning by Laurie Lee. I loved the name Laurie Lee, and I loved this man on the cover. I thought one day I'm going to become a traveller too. And I did become a traveller, but I always wondered who this man really was. And I'm still asking that question today. Laurie Lee's reputation today rests on 3 autobiographical works, all of which deal with his early life. Cider with Rosie tells the story of his childhood in Gloucestershire. As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning describes his walk across Spain in 1935. And A Moment of War covers his return to Spain a year later, during the Spanish Civil War. In all 3, he reveals an extraordinary poetic ability to encapsulate a feeling of place. But is that entirely what we want? Above all, surely we look to travellers to bring us back an authentic experience, a real idea of what's out there. So how real was the Spain he described? And how real was his portrait of himself? I'm retracing some of Laurie Lee's journey across Spain to try and find out, and see if his poetic vision of life actually works as travel writing. Laurie Lee was not your classic travel writer. He appeared here as if from nowhere, with no clear sense of ambition, a young man of no learning, no clear purpose. And he passed through here like a wandering minstrel or troubadour, and yet distilled those experiences into what I think is one of the greatest travel books ever written.
When I first saw Spain, I was 20 years old, rich only in ignorance and time. But only a day after my arrival, I knew that it was for this I had come, to look out on a world for which I had no words, and a place that as yet had no memories for me. It was the fulfillment of one of my first dreams as a child, to stand on foreign ground, knowing that everything around me, man, bird and beast, would be new, mysterious and nameless. It was like being born again, and ever since the word Spain has had a special magic for me.
As a young man, Laurie Lee would wander restlessly over these hills above his home in the Slad Valley in Gloucestershire. Whatever he was searching for, it wasn't here. Instead, he found Spain and a love affair with the country and its people that lasted all his life. And surely it's this highly charged, emotional involvement that gives As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning its power. But you know what? We wouldn't have had any of that
lifelong affair with Spain if it hadn't been for the extraordinary success of Cider with Rosie, a book that made Laurie Lee a household name and that described a world that was the exact opposite. Look at it, lush, green, quintessentially English, a whole world away from dry, dusty Spain. Or is it? Maybe there are strange parallels between these two worlds that will help us understand something of the man and his writing.
For the lovers of Cider with Rosie, this countryside is the absolute essence of Laurie Lee. Born down the road in Stroud in 1914, Laurie was brought up in this cottage in the village of Slad. A slow, simple upbringing in a vestige of rural England that was fast vanishing then and long gone now. But even though he left school at 15, there was a lot more to Laurie Lee than the ignorant country boy he liked to portray himself as in later life.
A lot of people who left school at 15 then were much better educated than 15-year-olds are today. They read widely. It was reading that educated him. He was self-taught. But also he had great luck in finding cultivated people, including the violin, being taught the violin by this itinerant violin teacher. He met people who read, and the girls he met particularly were very well read.
After 3 years working in an office in Stroud, Laurie knew it was time to escape. And in 1934, when he was 19, that's exactly what he did.
This is where it all began. Laurie Lee set out one midsummer morning on a day much like this, from that very house up this very path, on a journey that would change his life forever.
I was propelled, of course, by the traditional forces that have sent many generations along this road, by the small, tight valley closing in around me, stifling the breath with its mossy mouth, the cottage walls narrowing like the arms of an iron maiden, the local girls whispering, "Marry and settle down."
Laurie set forth with all the naive confidence of youth. His only thought was that he must see the wider world. He also had the romantic notion that he'd earn his keep along the way, by busking.
It was a wonderful way of getting to know people and getting people to like him wherever he went. He took up his fiddle, and it was charming and romantic that he could stand in the corner of a room and play.
Like generations of young men, Laurie Lee was drawn by the idea of London. Unlike most of them, he decided to walk there. But even before he'd left the village, he was homesick.
I found myself longing for some opposition or rescue, for the sound of hurrying footsteps coming after me, and family voices calling me back. None came. I was free. I was affronted by freedom.
I remember feeling exactly the same myself when I set off on my early travels. But the difference was that I always had a clear goal, and Laurie had yet to find any purpose at all. He did walk all the way to London, though, detouring via the south coast, as extraordinarily he claimed never to have seen the sea. A girl he knew in Putney put him up, and now he needed a job.
He went and worked on a building site as a labourer. But he also, even then, was walking up and down Charing Cross Road, looking at old antiquarian bookshops, listening to jazz, going to poetry readings, reading newspapers, getting to be a cultivated young man about town.
But after a year in 1930s London, Laurie still hadn't found what he wanted. He decided he must go abroad.
So where should I go? Somewhere or other, I picked up a phrase in Spanish for, "Will you please give me a glass of water?" And it was probably this rudimentary bit of lifeline that finally made up my mind.
He took to speaking Spanish quite easily, having been taught by the girl from Buenos Aires. So unlikely that you'd meet someone from Buenos Aires, but he did, in his home village, who taught him to say, "Un vaso de agua, por favor." This one key phrase, "Please may I have a glass of water?"
So, Spain it was. A whimsical choice that seems quite characteristic of the embryonic young poet. He landed in Vigo in July 1935 and headed west across the vast Zamoran plain. It was enough for him just to breathe in the unfamiliar land, with no intent beyond absorbing its textures, smells and sounds.
I felt it was for this I'd come, to look out on a world for which I had no words, to start at the beginning, speechless and without plan, in a place that still had no memories for me.
In the 1960s, Laurie Lee retraced parts of his old route across Spain for a BBC documentary film. In his narration, he adorned his original text with ever more evocative images, like an artist adding new layers of paint to an old picture.
Walking alone through the great empty Spanish landscapes, I slept wherever the night time found me. Lying out on some rocky hillside, I watched the sun go down. This was perhaps the easiest, loneliest, and best time of my life.
The first place that I knew for certain that my journey coincided exactly with Laurie's was outside the small town of Toro.
Each morning as I set off, I seldom knew where I was going. Toro, for instance, when I first saw it, was a tattered town on a cliff like dried blood on the edge of a rusty sword.
A tattered town on the cliff, looking like dried blood on the edge of a rusty sword. And what precision those words have, what weight. The words not simply of a writer, but of a poet.
The same cobbled cliff path winds up to the town, step for donkeys and ignoring the wheel. It smells the same too, a mixture of soap, open drains, animals and bitter geraniums. 30 years and nothing has changed but me.
Another 40 years on, and plenty has changed in Toro. But walking round the town, there's still that sense of timelessness conjured up so long ago in Laurie Lee's meticulous prose.
I sat in a chair outside the Café Espagnol and watched the parade go by. Each strolling young man was a pocket dandy, carefully buttoned in spite of the heat. Each girl a crisp, freshly laundered doll, flamboyantly lacy round neck and knees.
Back home in the village of Slad, where they both still live, I showed the footage of Laurie to his widow Kathy and their daughter Jessie. They'd never seen this archive before. I felt it was as if mother and daughter were meeting Laurie Lee afresh.
I feel very moved seeing him. I mean, I remember him as a much older man, and watching him now, I feel almost transported in time, as if we're of a similar age, and he's not my father, and I'm just with him in a different dimension.
What he's doing is he's just imbibing life, drinking it in, and then just explaining what it is, and so that other people can also find the life there.
I'd arrived during the week of Toro's fiesta. I asked an old woman if she would be going to see it. She grabbed a newspaper and said, "I've got 4 nieces in the procession. They're all riding swans, and all are as beautiful as angels."
I love the way he seems to go into a Gloucestershire accent there. Didn't you notice? But don't you love the way that he really is? He's gone to Spain as if to find something lost here, but when he's giving the Spanish a voice, he gives them a broad Gloucester accent.
Yes,
so they are,
exactly.
They've become the citizens of Slad Valley.
Exactly, and this is how he's feeling, isn't
Yes,
he? He
yes.
just feels at home.
Yeah.
And it seems like a return to innocence. That
Yes.
seems to come through so deeply, really.
In Spain, I immediately felt a strange sense of continuity, of something that had not yet broken with the past, something pastoral which I soon learned to recognize. A few miles from the main road, they could have been anywhere. India, Turkestan, Cyprus, Mexico, even Stow-on-the-Wold 1,000 years back.
I think he's a kind of catalyst, I don't know quite what word to use, for what life is.
I was thinking he almost distills the quality
That's the word,
that
yes.
he's experiencing and encapsulates it like a spirit.
Today, we mainly think of Laurie Lee as a prose writer, but his first love was poetry, just as his natural instincts were poetic. Self-taught, he'd been writing poems since he was 15, and he'd even had a couple published before he left for Spain. I met his friend and fellow poet P.J. Kavanagh at the local cricket field that Laurie bought for the village in later life.
They were very strange poems. They were unlike anybody else's, but strange, surreal imageries and very, very sensuous, very, and also, unusually for poems, frequently celebratory. Yes. Such a morning it is when love leans through geranium windows and calls with a cockerel's tongue, when red-haired girls scamper like roses over the rain-green grass, and the sun drips honey. When hedgerows grow venerable, berries dry black as blood, and holes suck in their bees. Such a morning it is when mice run whispering from the church, dragging dropped ears of harvest. When the partridge draws his spring and shoots like a buzzing arrow over grained and mahogany fields. When no table is bare, and no breast dry, and the tramp feeds off ribs of rabbit. Such a day it is when time piles up the hills like pumpkins, and the streams run golden, when all men smell good, and the cheeks of girls are as baked bread to the mouth, as bread and bean flowers the touch of their lips, and their white teeth sweeter than cucumbers. It's an impressionistic celebration of sensuous delight.
After 5 weeks on the road, Laurie Lee reached Segovia. I hadn't realised that its fairy tale castle was Walt Disney's inspiration for the castle in Sleeping Beauty. It was just such encounters with the unexpected that also enlivened Laurie.
I never knew what was going to hit me next. And on my first approach to Segovia, I had no idea that suddenly through the hills the Roman aqueduct would appear. A unique and visual shock. This phenomenon of masonry strides across a landscape, 100 vistas framed by its arches, its great blocks of granite cunningly held in place by their weight alone, till it crosses the city at rooftop height, stepping like a mammoth among the houses. I'd never heard of this thing before, but that night I remember I slept under one of its 2,000-year-old arches.
I found Segovia rather charming and unspoilt. But on his return here, Laurie Lee was pained by the way it had changed. This perhaps pointing to what he was really seeking in Spain.
I remember Segovia as a place of ragged, almost oriental poverty, where a stranger's face was a matter of unusual interest. Tourism has changed all that. But the old relationship between host and visitor has inevitably been corrupted and cheapened. Tourism always corrupts, and no country can stand against it. Indeed, I'm not so sure that next to war, tourism isn't the greatest calamity to have happened to us this century.
There's a loss of purity and innocence which seems to just come up time and time again, and certainly through looking at this. I'm struck.
Yes. And it seems to take it very personally, doesn't it? Because, of course, it is the death of his dream, in a sense, as well, because this world that he was looking for was being killed off.
It's almost like a tarnishing of the soul. It's a very deep thing that he's trying to get across, and he's determined to do that, and it comes across in his writing. The real world was quite hard for him.
If Laurie found the real world hard, now, as he crossed the Sierra Guadarrama on that first journey, he found something out there that resonated profoundly with him.
Before me, through the pass, I saw a new country emerge, the immense plain of La Mancha, stretching flat as a cowhide and smudged like a sore with the distant city of Madrid. I was perhaps never so alive and so alone again.
I was struck by that use of the word alone, and I remember having exactly the same feeling myself, but how beautifully and yet simply he'd found a way to express it. I was beginning to feel that Laurie Lee had a rather annoying amount of natural talent.
You're wearing, looking at her scarf. He did some wonderful portraits.
What did he do?
He had a, I mean, it's rather like with his poetry and his music, there was always a sort of purity of line, you know, purity of sentence. I mean, for instance, this is Jessie, my Jessie as a baby, which is charming.
But again, as you say, the purity of the line, the simplicity.
The whole feeling is good, isn't it?
Look at that, wonderful. I wonder how he saw himself. I'm just looking at that self-portrait. Do you see himself as a poet, as a writer?
I think he thought of himself as a poet, primarily, I think. Because, in fact, even when he wrote, it was poetic.
Yes,
and he
absolutely.
was very poetic in the whole way he did things. I mean, but then I'm his wife, I'm a bit prejudiced.
Look at those. Extraordinary.
But I like these news because, you know, again, you get this amazing
So that's 38.
simplicity.
It's almost unfair that this man should have so many talents in one in one
Can you
go.
imagine living with it? I mean, goodness me,
But was he
no talent at all.
Well, did you? Not an easy person to live with. I mean, all artists,
no,
they have to
exactly.
do their thing, don't they?
Absolutely.
In 1938, back in England after his Spanish adventures, the 23-year-old Laurie Lee had yet to find much sense of purpose. But within a couple of years, he somehow transformed himself into a rising star in the London literary establishment. The catalyst, as often in his life, was a woman. That summer, Lorna Wishart noticed Laurie, like some beguiling Pied Piper, playing his violin on a beach in Cornwall. She was 3 years older than him, rich, rampantly sexual, and she was married with 2 children. But Lorna was a free spirit, and Laurie was always drawn to strong, attractive women. They began an intense affair that lasted for 5 years and produced a daughter, Yasmin, who was brought up by Lorna and her husband as their own. And it was Lorna who used her literary connections to introduce Laurie's poetry to the publishers of the day.
Lorna sent his work to Cyril Connolly and Stephen Spender at Horizon, and they published him. Laurie was very lucky. He was swept up. He was obliged to go on writing. And at one point he wrote to Cyril Connolly and Stephen Spender to ask, were they publishing him just because he was a proletarian? And Stephen Spender wrote back and said, no, if they published people just because they were proletarians, Horizon would be as thick as a telephone directory. No, they genuinely thought he had some talent.
Although only 25 years old when war broke out, Laurie Lee was never called up. The reason was something he tried to hide from the world all his life, his chronically poor health.
He did have a terrible sickness anyway that he had to put up with
Yes.
all his life, and that didn't help him.
Epilepsy.
Yes, and it's almost that portrait is extraordinary because it's almost it describes the feeling that he might have had.
I didn't know about it till I was 26 when I was working with children with special needs and recognised that the drugs they were taking were the same as the ones that Dad was taking. And I think because the illness was epilepsy and there's this, he felt it was a very undignified illness to have, which is a terrible shame for him, and he was very ashamed of having this illness.
I think a lot of the terrors were there was not enough time in his life to write, because so much of the time he was ill. So I think there was this balance between the terror and then the productive element.
He would have fevers, wouldn't he? He would.
Oh, on top of
he
that,
had malaria, I think, at
on
some
top
point. So
of
he had,
that.
on top of this, he had, you know, he had one lung. One lung lead.
One lung lead.
Yeah. One lung lead.
Dear.
There was always something, and that must have made him very nervous.
Can you imagine? Yes.
But we would have to be very, very quiet and take the phones off the hook and make sure nobody came round. And again, you know, the same thing with people turning up unannounced would be a terrifying thing for him.
Despite his illnesses, Laurie did find useful work during the war. His elder brother Jack had become a film director with the Crown Film Unit, and he found Laurie a job as a scriptwriter. Soon, Laurie was mixing in illustrious circles in the arts, penning speeches for the likes of Laurence Olivier, and putting to good use another of his many talents, and one he was well aware of, his mercurial charm.
He wrote about it. He wrote about what constitutes charm. Charm is the ultimate weapon, the supreme seduction, against which there are few defences. If you've got it, you need almost nothing else, neither money, looks, nor pedigree. It's a gift, only given to give away, and the more used, the more there is. It's wonderful, isn't it? It's exactly what got him everywhere. It got him everywhere in life, everywhere geographically. Charm. It was legendary.
Ever since childhood, I'd imagined myself walking down a white, dusty road through groves of orange trees to a city called Seville.
I'd always been intrigued to see what Seville would be like. Laurie's description of the people there is full of contradictions. On the one hand, it's hard-edged, unsentimental. On the other, he's enthralled, clearly intoxicated by all the colour and grit.
Seville was no paradise. There was a customary squalor behind it, children and beggars sleeping out in the gutters under a coating of disease and filth. By day, their condition seemed somewhat less intolerable, and they presented a jaunty face to the world. All were part of the city, the adored Seville, to which even the beggars claimed pride of belonging, where ragged little girls would raise their thin brown arms and dance rapturously at the least excuse. It was a city of traditional allegria, where gaiety was almost a civic duty, something which rich and poor wore with arrogant finesse, simply because the rest of Spain expected it. Like the Viennese, the Sevillanas lived under this burden of legend, and were forced into carefree excesses, compelled to flounce and swagger as the embodiment of Andalusia, in spite of frequent attacks of liverish exhaustion.
He loved everything that was Spain. I mean, he loved that fantastic singing and you know, the dancing and the quick-wittedness. There's just something so vital. I think that's probably the thing he loved.
Seville seems to mark the end of Laurie Lee's innocence, the naivety that had sustained him through Spain so far. From here on, everything would be a little bit more complicated.
Until now, I'd accepted this country without question, as though visiting a half-crazed family. But it was in Seville, on the bridge, watching the river at midnight, that I got the first hint of coming trouble. A young sailor approached me with, "Hello, Johnny," and asked for a cigarette. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but if you want to see blood, stick around. You're going to see plenty."
All across Spain, the country Laurie Lee had fallen in love with was about to tear itself apart in civil war. The people had elected a left-wing Republican government, but that was now being challenged by a growing fascist movement, led by the renegade General Franco. But for a while, Laurie heard no more about the ominous tension growing across Spain. And I can see why, as I followed his trail across the vast, empty plains of Andalusia.
This is the heart of Andalusia, raw, indolent, silent, and like the sea, still largely untouched. But it was tough going, I remember. One walked knee-deep in the heat. The road was an equator in a burning world. I had visions of English moss and watercress.
By the late 1940s, Laurie Lee had begun a new phase in his life. Finding himself drawn yet again to the tempo and energy of London, he adopted a bohemian existence in Chelsea, among other poets, writers, artists and musicians. In 1950, he was offered an unusual job as chief captions writer for the Festival of Britain.
So he had a proper job, an office, and a pipe, and a sports jacket.
But the job only lasted a year or so, and Laurie had to fall back on his poetry and other occasional small commissions. Laurie's affair with Lorna Wishart had ended in 1944 when she left him for the artist Lucian Freud. And in 1950 he married Cathy Polge, who happened to be Lorna's niece. Laurie was almost 36, Cathy just 18. He'd known her since she was 5, and they'd begun courting when she was 14.
I came home from school one day and there was this lovely chap leaning against the gas stove with a kind of Irish tweed coat and floppy blonde hair. And I sort of saw him and I thought, oh. And I never looked back, really. Plenty of charm, but good kind of charm, because there are different types of charm, aren't there?
With a young wife to keep, Laurie needed money. Poetry on its own just didn't pay enough. But in 1951, fortune stepped in. A travel bursary simply fell into his lap. All he had to do was go off anywhere and write about it. He jumped at the chance.
He did mention Spain. I said, oh, of course, that's what we'll do. That can be our honeymoon, a trip to Spain.
Here was a chance for Laurie to take Cathy along the part of his Spanish walk that had affected him most profoundly in his youth.
From this hill road, I came down to the seaport of Algeciras. I didn't know it then, but this rather raffish town was to become one of my favourite hideouts abroad. It's a poor-looking place with rough, ugly edges and almost nothing you would want to put on a poster. But in fact, it's complex, cosmopolitan, full of rogues and poets, and leads several distinctly flavoured lives.
It strikes me that one of the reasons why he loved this place so much is that it's a sort of collection of all these characters who are somehow very real. He loathed the tourist tat, and here you feel 1,000 miles away from all that.
He was always writing notes, and he'd go off on his own quite a lot of the time, because I think he still wanted to feel he was alone in Spain, not with someone dragging around behind.
At most street corners, one would be offered exotic items of merchandise unavailable anywhere else in Spain. Mouldy chocolate, laddered stockings, damp American cigarettes. leaky Parker pens and fake Swiss watches. But for all its disreputable purposes and confidence trickery, it seemed to be a town entirely free of malice, and even the worst of its crooks were so untrained in malevolence that no one was expected to take them seriously. In its position as a bridge between Europe and Morocco, the port could have equaled Marseille in evil, but its heart wasn't in it. In spite of the opportunities, it preferred small transgressions with lesser rewards.
Kathy, his wife, talks about how Laurie used to just disappear off. He used to separate himself, sit down at a cafe, much like this, with his notebook, and he'd try and capture what was going on.
I spent part of my time with a gang of youths who earned their living spiking handbags with fishhooks, who got rid of their loot in the bars and brothels and begged their meals at the local convent. The leader of the gang was a globe-trotter from Lisbon who claimed to be walking around the world, but he was always slipping back home to fetch something he'd forgotten, and he'd taken 2 years to get as far as this.
Algeciras is fascinating to me because it shows up completely different sides of Laurie's character. He was the silent observer, but he was also an enthusiastic participant in places like this, actively engaged with the people.
I was allowed to go out with him sometimes. We used to go to the bars together. And that's when I first could see the reaction of everybody. We'd go into a bar, and in a moment he'd be surrounded. And everybody would be laughing, because he'd be probably punning in Spanish. And I realised then that he had this strange, wonderful rapport with people.
I've always enjoyed Laurie Lee's writing. I mean, since the age of 10 or whatever it was, I tried to grapple with this world he was conjuring up. And I didn't know back then whether he got it right or not. But sitting here in a cafe, seeing people, I feel he's got it right.
Every word is a jewel, and when you read the book, you're not reading just a story of how to get from Madrid to Sevilla. You're reading a story about his thoughts, and where every word that you take off the page has tremendous meaning. There's one point where he's walking across Castilla-La Mancha, and he's just resting and lying on the almost dry ground, picking at some blades of grass. And his words he writes were, "Never in my life have I been so fat with time." Well, that is just a glorious phrase.
Back home in the London of the early 50s, Laurie Lee now entered what some of his friends called his years of procrastination. Although the travel bursary obliged him to write about his trip to Andalusia with Kathy, he just wouldn't sit down and put pen to paper. His social life seemed to take up far too much of his time. But he was slowly working on the material, and in 1955 produced A Rose for Winter, his first book of prose.
It got very respectable reviews, except from Kingsley Amis, who hated it. But Kingsley had this thing about romanticising abroad, which he found tiresome. People who told stories about going abroad, as if anybody wanted to know. Anyway, so he didn't like it, but everybody else did.
A Rose for Winter was a critical, if not a huge commercial success, and it showed Laurie that there was a career and money to be made from combining his poet's sensibility with the experiences of his past. Now he saw himself as a writer of prose, and that in future the source of his work would be his own life.
He began as a poet, and I knew him first as a poet. And when he began to write prose to make his living, to make some money, he wrote poetically, and some people say too poetically. I don't really. I don't see why. That's how he wrote. His prose is very like his poems. But he stopped writing poems as a consequence.
Through the 1950s, Laurie continued to live in London. He didn't seem to be writing much, but in fact he was delving deeper into his past. For 10 years, he worked and reworked a book based on his childhood in Gloucestershire. In 1959, he published Cider with Rosie. The book was an instant bestseller and quickly became a classic of English literature. So far, it's sold over 6 million copies.
I sold loads and loads of his books. I was a direct account with the publishers, so...
Well, you had an account here with the publishers?
Yes.
So selling them behind the bar?
Oh yes, we sold loads. And in fact, there's a bookcase over there that he provided, and all his books were in there. He would come and sit in the corner here or in the other room, and he'd sign goodness knows how many, and as many as he signed I could sell. In fact, it turned out in the end people said the rare ones, the ones that weren't signed.
I once in a bookshop in Mississippi, I bought a remaindered version of Cider with Rosie by an American publisher for about sort of $1, and I brought it back here and I said, "Here, Laurie, you haven't signed this."
That's the one that got away.
Yes. How many books do you think you signed? Oh, there were sold here?
Hundreds.
Yeah.
Hundreds. I can't tell you exactly, I can't remember without looking at the records, but very often an average of about 700 or 800 a month, I think.
No,
staggering.
Huge figure.
Yes, staggering.
Now, the legend of Laurie Lee began to take on a life of its own. It was helped by Laurie himself. He moved back to Slade in 1959 and reinvented himself as the rustic Gloucestershire lad that his readers seemed to want.
He knew he was playing a role. Is that right, David?
I'm sure it is. And he enjoyed playing the role, there's no doubt about that. Let's face it, Cider with Rosie sort of really put him on the map, and he was very proud of it, and I think rightly so.
But Laurie still craved the social and intellectual buzz of London, and he now began to live several quite separate lives.
Well, he's compartmentalised. He went back and forth to London all the time. He escaped every week back to London, back to his flat, just off the King's Road, and he went back to the Chelsea Arts Club and to the Queen's Elm pub, where he was an urban figure.
So by his early 50s, Laurie's life had found a pattern. Weekends in Slade with Cathy and their new daughter Jessie, and the rest of the time on a regular round of his London haunts.
We were sitting in the club, and I said, "OK, Laurie, now I think is the time," and I put a bottle of scotch down. He said, because he liked to drink whiskey and beer together, one in each hand. He said, by the time we did these photographs, we'd polished off half the bottle, so we were in quite a rosy condition. And he then started this extraordinary romance with Venus de Milo. And then there's another photograph which is, I call Wine, Women and... that's the one, yes. With his violin, his glass, and Venus in the background.
Got everything there.
And...
yeah, those lovely seductive eyes, the sort of softly devoted eyes looking into hers.
Yeah, that's Laurie thinking about women.
But after the publication of Cider with Rosie, Laurie's output, which was never prolific, seemed to dry up completely.
Didn't you say, what are you working on now? I mean, was that never a question you could ask?
You could not ask a question like that to a writer.
Well,
No,
to
you
him.
cannot, no, to any writer, I don't think. What are you working on now? I mean, it's not the thing to do.
There are plenty of writers I think would be very happy to answer that question, but Laurie wasn't one. And
No,
you wouldn't know to your father, couldn't you say, "Daddy,
I was
come
so
on."
used to his secrecy, and I was so used to the doors being locked and shut, and it was just something I knew from this big. I knew instinctively when to just hold back or keep out or not ask.
He would sit at his desk, but one day he notes in his diary, "I can't be doing much work. There's a spider web between the end of my pencil and the windows." So he just didn't. He was meaning to write, but didn't actually get anything written. He would write down other things. He counted the coins in his pocket. He measured the growth of the geraniums in the plant pots. He noted how far the grass had grown. He wrote down what he drank every day, which was too much.
This is almost obsessive, isn't it? On and on and on. Cloudy, fine, warm, humidity, 28 degrees.
Well, he did have this obsessive part of his personality, his nature. And I think that, you know, having seen some of these lists, and they're so immaculate, I sort of wondered why he did this, and what, you know, when he was meant to be writing, why did he do this? And I had a sort of notion that he did suffer anxiety. I mean, really deep anxiety, and I think he also felt terribly guilty when he wasn't writing. And I think, in order to compensate for that, he did these lists.
Back in the autumn of 1935, the young Laurie Lee was walking east along the Spanish coast through what are now the mass tourist colonies of the Costa del Sol. At the end of November, he arrived at the coastal town of Almuñécar, where he was to spend the next 6 months. In the 1930s, Almuñécar was a run-down fishing port. Laurie's rather downbeat description of the local population has always intrigued me.
The old women stark and black as desert matriarchs, their bodies loaded with unhealthy fat, and the men small and bony, like dried-up birds. The villagers were infected with a fatalism, a kind of subdued and deliberate apathy. Only sometimes, in the eyes of the younger men, did one see the violent hopes they lived for.
I knew Almuñécar was bound to have changed since Laurie was here, but my heart sank as I contemplated the monstrous wall of concrete apartments which now completely cuts off the old town from the sea. It was inevitable, perhaps, but here it seemed all the intensity and texture of the Spain Laurie so cherished was gone for good. Then suddenly, up in the town, the real Almuñécar exploded into life. It was the festival of Corpus Christi, and the locals were out in force for the age-old procession. I was glad to sense no sign here of the fatalism or apathy that Laurie described. Despite the blanket of tourism, the heart of this community is alive and well. But like the rest of Spain, Almuñécar has a darker episode clouding its history. It was here, in the summer of 1936, that Laurie Lee witnessed the start of the civil war he'd been warned about back in Seville. Although never political, Laurie's sympathies naturally lay with the Republican peasants, farmers and labourers he'd grown to love, who now faced Franco and his fascists. As the fighting intensified, Laurie's Spanish journey came to a sudden and unexpected end. In August 1936, a Royal Navy destroyer appeared in the Bay of Almuñécar, sent from Gibraltar to pick up Britons trapped along the coast. Within hours, Laurie was on board, and only 5 days later, he was back in Slade.
All I'd known in that country, or had felt without knowing it, seemed to come upon me then. Lost now, and too late to have any meaning, my 12 months' journey gone. Spain drifted away from me, thunder bright on the horizon, and I left it there beneath its copper clouds.
But Laurie couldn't put Spain out of his mind, and the following year, in December 1937, he went back. Ever the romantic, he walked over the Pyrenees, through the snows of winter, to join the Republicans as they fought a losing battle against the fascists.
So why did Laurie Lee return to Spain and face the dangers of the Civil War? It's almost as if he took the whole business personally, that he somehow wanted to return the hospitality offered up by the ordinary people of Spain. One way or another, it's as if there was unfinished business here. And he put it like this: I couldn't help feeling a private sense of betrayal.
Ya me he enterado y que mi niño estaba bueno.
But Laurie's own role in the Civil War wasn't to go the way he'd hoped.
He had one of his epileptic fits as soon as he arrived, and he was looked after. He joined the International Brigades. He was a good comrade. He wrote poems there, and he wrote and described the scene of that terrible winter and the conditions they lived in. They were all so poor, and they were starving, these men, and he wrote about that very, very vividly. I mean, nobody described it better.
For Laurie, the Civil War was a brief and disappointing interlude. He was shipped back to England again after only 9 weeks in Spain. But the experience had a profound effect on him for the rest of his life.
He was very conscious of his obligation to those who had died, that to write the story. And he kept saying, I owe it to them, I owe it to them. But I know it was agony.
Yet Laurie wouldn't write his book about the Civil War for more than half a century after he was there. Meanwhile, in the 1960s, he'd become a household name. Cider with Rosie was a set text in schools. Coaches full of tourists drove through the Slad Valley, eager to see the locations Laurie so enduringly portrayed, or even a glimpse of the country lad himself. Laurie was usually friendly and approachable, but not always.
He did actually have days when he would not see anybody, and we had one particular day, a very nice gentleman came in with a portrait of him, and he would not move out of this bar to see that gentleman either, and so it was sort of a Mexican standoff. He was one end of the pub and this other person was the other end of the pub, and he would not move, so we never did see that portrait.
To the frustration of his public, there was now another 10 years delay while Laurie slowly wrote and rewrote his next book, honing his memories of that seminal year he'd spent in Spain. In 1969, at the age of 55, he finally published As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. Another bestseller, its title hinted at the connections Laurie saw between Spain and Slad.
When I happened to ask about the title, As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning, and he said, well, it's an old Gloucestershire folk song. And he started to sing. As I walked out one midsummer morning, or something like that, because I've forgotten the tune. And he sang the whole song.
There were times when you said that, you know, being in Spain really is like being in Slad. There's a lot in common, you know. And I understand that. I mean, if you go into the bars in Spain with all the chaps there, laughing and joking, I mean, it's the same as going into the Woolpack, in a way. And I think he felt very at home there, but at the same time it was different. So it was an adventure, and an adventure wakes things up in you, doesn't it?
As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning had revealed the depth of Laurie's emotional involvement with Spain. And in a teasing epilogue, he suggested there might yet be another book to come.
I saw a little farmhouse. I knocked on the door. It was opened by a young man with a rifle who held up a lantern to my face. I noticed he was wearing the Republican armband. I've come to join you, I said. Pase usted, he answered. I was back in Spain with a winter of war before me.
But through the 1970s and 80s, there was no sign of a book about the Civil War. Laurie was getting older and his health poorer, and there was another reason for the delay. Shortly after As I Walked Out was published in 1969, Laurie had gone to Spain with the BBC to make a film about his walk. It's the footage we've been watching in this programme. In August, they were in Segovia.
It was here, right in the heart of Segovia, that Laurie Lee suffered what was for him a total disaster. It was 1969, and he'd come to retrace his journey with the BBC film crew, much as I'm doing today. They nipped out for lunch and returned to find the BBC car had been broken into. A lot of camera equipment had been stolen, but for him, the great tragedy was that his precious diaries covering his journey through Spain had gone as well.
The theft of all his notes in Spain affected him very badly, and I think that made him a little paranoid about holding on to all these notes all the time.
Despite the loss of his diaries, Laurie was determined to finish the book. And in 1991, aged 77, he finally produced A Moment of War. It polarised opinion. Savaged by some veterans of the Civil War who questioned its factual accuracy, more widely it was praised as a powerfully honest rendition of a young man's personal experience of war.
The road would lead me down to Andalusia and the Mediterranean. At least this is what I hoped. What I didn't know was that it would also lead me to the end of peace and to the beginning of the most bitter civil war of the century.
Do you think he felt he had to write that book for completion?
I'm sure you're right about that, but also he loved the Spaniards so much that the idea that they'd lost, that they had this awful struggle, and he was there, seeing what was happening. I think he really felt he had to write this book because of his love of Spain.
So they didn't get forgotten?
Well, yes, quite.
But
yes.
I think what you're saying about completion, there's a lot to be said for that too.
Laurie Lee died at home in May 1997, aged 82. I think the legacy of this man was his ability to connect the essential qualities of life, from the world of his childhood in Slade to the peasants of Spain, delivering them to us stripped down to their human fundamentals.
Looking back, did Laurie Lee bring us the real Spain? Did he bring us the real Slade Valley and Cider with Rosie? Or maybe that's not quite the right question, because we've got guidebooks to bring us pure fact. What Laurie Lee did was something quite different, but equally important. He set out on our behalf, a man of extraordinary sensibility, and acting as our eyes, our ears, he used his poetic vision to help us understand the places he knew and loved.
I set out hoping to understand Laurie Lee, but to me he still remains an enigma. However we describe him though, the wandering minstrel, the Pied Piper, I believe it's that elusive, almost magical quality which enables him to lose himself in other worlds and invoke them. He does this with an intensity that few travellers, for all their erudition or more daring deeds, could ever hope to match.
The final part in Benedict Allen's series, The Traveller's Century, with the writings of Patrick Leigh Fermor, is next Thursday at 9. What do you think of our Journeys of Discovery season so far? Have your say at bbc.co.uk/BBC4. Next